مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. من هو أنجح السياسيين لعام 2023؟ ليس جو بايدن الذي سجل انتصارات تشريعية متتالية، فقد أنهى الآن بخسارة معظم استطاعات الرأي المتعلقة بالانتخابات الرئاسية للعام القادم. ولم يكن دونالد ترامب الذي يواجه إلى محاكم أمريكا تهما جنائية تدعي إلى سجنه لمئات السنين. لم يكن كيفن مكارثي الذي حصل على أعلى منصب جمهوري في البلاد في بداية العام ثم انتهى به الأمر عاطلا عن العمل. ولم يكن رون دي سانتس الذي كان يعمل في بداية العام أن ينافس دونالد ترامب على ترشيح الحزب الجمهوري له المنصب الرئاسة ثم انتهى به الأمر في المركز الثالث. ولم يكن بالتأكيد جورج سانتوس الذي طردوه زملائه من الكونغرس لممارسته الكذب، وهو قرار غريب بالنظر للكذب الذي يمارسه سياسيون عدد في كل يوم. إذن من هو السياسي الأنجح لعام 2023؟ هذا هو سؤالنا لضيوفنا الخبراء في السياسة جيسيكا تايلور، نايومي ليم وراسل بيرمان. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Everyone loves a winner, so the saying goes. So this week on our show, we're going to ask, who were the winners of 2023? And of course, who weren't the winners? So I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Taylor, Naomi Lim, and Russell Berman. Thank you for joining us this week. Jessica, who was the most successful presidential candidate of 2023? A year in which we had no election, of course, so we're all looking out to the election next November.
I think you have to say that it's still Donald Trump, that despite all of his indictments and everything that conventional wisdom in a pre-Donald Trump world, pre-2015 would tell us would sink our traditional candidate, he continues to have commanding leads. You know, the primary to take him on, it's almost felt like a charade that they're having these debates, but do they really matter? And he's, you know, even by not appearing in them, his brand is still strong. He's, you know, he actually started 2023 after the 2022 midterms where Republicans very much underperformed and at a weaker spot. And that's why I think, you know, some of his opponents like Ron DeSantis could have seized better on that moment had they announced sooner. But instead, he goes into 2024 not very long until the Iowa caucuses begin, where he has a commanding lead in polling and in national polling as the clear and away frontrunner.
Does anybody disagree with this assessment that Donald Trump was the most successful presidential candidate of the past year?
It's hard to disagree. I mean, you know, when you look back a year ago, it's hard to imagine him being in a better position than he is right now, right? Because it's hard to imagine that he would be leading in the polls, hypothetically, against Joe Biden. And some of the polls have shown that his standing is higher than it was at any point during even during his presidency. So I think it is pretty remarkable. I might give the runner-up might be Robert Kennedy Jr., who nobody really expected would make much of an impression. But, you know, in some of these hypothetical three-way or multi-candidate general election polls, he's polling in double digits, and in a couple cases, I think over 20%, which is pretty, again, pretty surprising and pretty remarkable.
So, Naomi, if these are the candidates who performed well in this off year, who is the least successful presidential candidate of 2023? Someone who started the year with promise and ended the year, well, with those promises undelivered.
Well, I think just to add to the previous conversation, I also think that former UN or United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley has sort of performed well as well. I mean, I was at her launch in South Carolina in February, and I sort of went went down, not thinking that she would go the distance, and we're sort of seeing her continue to surge before the opening contest. So I would also just add her to the winners column. When we talk about pivoting to like the losers column, I think someone like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, I guess, was sort of handicapped because he came in with such high expectations, sort of as Jessica said, potentially if he had launched earlier than I think May, which was when the Florida legislative session ended in his state, you know, he might have been able to seize on some ground where we weren't quite sure how Trump was performing, one, because of the midterms, and two, because of you know, this slow drip of indictments that kept coming up, and he didn't potentially seize on that. I think what's been really surprising is we've sort of seen his poll numbers, sort of the more that voters get to see him and know him, sort of the more unsure they are of him. And so he's trying to, you know, trying to capitalize on maybe one more debate before the Iowa caucuses. He's sort of doing a little bit more different TV, moving more into sort of more legacy media, trying to do sort of CNN town halls and things like that to try and give him some momentum. But I think he's sort of, one, he has a problem with connecting with voters himself. He's also been disadvantaged because he's had lots of problems with his own campaign and sort of aligned outside groups. And so someone that came in sort of thinking that he would be Trump's predecessor or successor is someone that maybe we might not even be thinking about in the next election cycle.
So I saw that both Russell and Jessica were nodding their heads up and down with the underperformance of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Jessica, is there anyone else who that you would point your finger as saying, boy, underperformer? Who would that be?
Well, I'll agree with Naomi as well that I do think Nikki Haley has stood out, and she's sort of the candidate of the moment as we close 2024 with a lot of endorsements behind her. The New Hampshire Governor Kristen Sununu just recently endorsed her. But I think, you know, there were sort of other candidates there on the stage that seemed like they might have had promise. I really think of South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, who, again, African-American candidate, young, has a stellar record in the Senate. Sort of talk to that Christian conservative base. I really thought going in that he could really find an opportunity, and he had a lot of money and a super PAC and things, and he never really caught fire. So I think he's someone that I thought going in that if there was going to be sort of a candidate of the moment, that he could have had his moment, and that ended up not happening.
And Russell, any nominee for you for underperformer of the year?
I mean, I guess you have to say the president, Joe Biden, given his standing right now. You know, this is not, in some ways, it's not unusual. 12 years ago at this point, Barack Obama, there were some polls showing him losing hypothetically to Mitt Romney or, you know, a generic Republican. But Joe Biden, considering the Democrats a year ago did better than expected in the 2022 midterms. And that was, you know, the expectations was that that would give Biden, you know, some juice going into the presidential cycle, especially to resolve, you know, concerns about him running again at the age now of 81. But it really hasn't, at least in the polls, and neither has the economic improvement that we've seen. I mean, that's been the big you know, mystery and the big disconnect is statistically the economy is doing really well, and even with inflation, which has been the big voter concern, that's been coming down. Even in the end of the year, you know, data that's come out, inflation has continued to cool, and yet it has not at all seemed to reflect in President Biden's approval rating or his standing against Donald Trump. And right now he is losing to a candidate who is under criminal indictment, dozens of criminal indictments, and or dozens of charges, and you know, who just 3 years ago you know, helped to try to overturn an election. And so I think that's you know, unfortunately for Biden, that's just where he is right now, and it has not been a good year politically for him.
All right, so if this is the shape of the presidential set of candidates, let's turn to the other end of Capitol Hill for a minute. Naomi, when you look at Capitol Hill, who had a really good year? Who ends the year with a big smile on his or her face?
I think it's sort of hard to overlook the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who I think at the beginning of the year wasn't even having like the speakership role in his sights. I think that's something that sort of caught everyone by surprise. I mean, I know we were doing this this show sort of this time last year, and we thought, how long could Kevin McCarthy, you know, hold on to his position? And Mike Johnson is not someone that, you know, we had even discussed. So I think that it's hard to go beyond him. I think it's going to be interesting going forward. He only has sort of a 3-seat majority, I think, to play with within his house. He has some tough, you know, sort of policy issues with border negotiations, as well as an impeachment proceeding vote, or impeachment proceedings going forward as well. So he has a lot of hot button issues that has caused friction in his conference in the past, and to see how he kind of deals with that will be something that I will be watching. I think that he will have I think his colleagues will probably give him a little bit more grace in comparison to McCarthy, just because he doesn't have the long-standing sort of tensions within with other lawmakers. But I think he's someone that, you know, to see how he fundraises, for example, going into next year, and whether that they can hold on to their majority is something that will be really interesting.
All right, so it certainly makes sense that the surprise speaker that nobody expected will end the year with a smile on his face. But Jessica, Russell, when you look at Capitol Hill, is there anyone else who emerges can say, boy, that was a good year? Jessica?
I mean, maybe it's the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, just because of all the chaos on the Republican side. They're going to get new maps in New York now that could really help Democrats. And as Naomi mentioned, there's a 5-seat majority right now, but there's 2 vacancies or another one coming up, and a special election with George Santos gone now that Democrats can flip. I mean, the fact that Republicans had the majority was based on Republicans that sat in heavily Democratic areas, not because of these members that sort of cannibalized and ousted Kevin McCarthy. And I think it's Kevin McCarthy absolutely had the worst year. It's hard to think of anyone else that who did as much for the Republican Party in both fundraising and recruiting, and then was summarily outed. So I think Hakeem Jeffries is sitting there sort of as the new guard in the Democratic Party. And, you know, as I look at it right now, actually, the bright spot for Democrats is that they have a very good chance to flip the House majority. Better, I think, than even holding on to the Senate, and perhaps better than the White House. So I do think the House could be a bright spot for Democrats in 2024.
So, Russell, there's a lot of candidates for who had the worst year on Capitol Hill. Who's at the top of your list?
Well, we've already talked about the obvious one, which is Kevin McCarthy, who is out of a job and going to be out of Congress by the end of the year. Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise, they were 2 of the Republicans who tried to step up to replace McCarthy, and neither of them could get the votes on the floor of the House. Jordan in particular made his move, and then was, in the same way that, you know, McCarthy was humiliated at the beginning of the year with all of these all of the failed speaker votes. Jordan insisted on going to the floor without the support, and, you know, it's never fun to sit there in public with on national television and watch people basically reject you for a job, and that's what happened. Over on the Senate side, the Senate was a bit of a quieter place, as it sometimes is when nothing gets done in Congress. But Mitch McConnell did not have a very good year. It's an unfortunate year for him. He had some health issues. He took a fall. I believe that was toward the beginning of the year. Was slow to recover. He had a couple of well-publicized incidents where he kind of froze up during press conferences, which sparked a lot of concern about whether he had in fact recovered from the concussion. He's not a young man. I think he's getting close to 80. And the other thing politically is that possibly related to these health issues is it seems that he's lost some of his clout within the Senate Republican conference. And the big issue, Ukraine funding. He has been increasingly lonely on the Republican side and being a stalwart, supporting President Biden, supporting Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, and pushing for more American support. And, you know, it's been clear that in the House, there's a lot of opposition to that. But even in the Senate, he just could not get enough Republicans to go along with him. And so, you know, as we close out the year, he has been basically forced to insist on border security and a change in border policies in exchange for funding Ukraine and funding Israel. And you know, that was not the position that I think he wanted to be in a few months ago.
And Naomi, unusual for in American history, two congressmen censured, one congressman expelled. This doesn't happen every year in the House of Representatives.
No, it was a watershed sort of year in terms of reprimands. I mean, we are seeing this sort of culture on Capitol Hill where things like impeachment and censures are happening at a clip or a rate that we haven't sort of seen in the past. But, you know, as you sort of mentioned, George Santos, who was probably like in one of my runnings in terms of having a bad year, expelled from Congress after being sort of elected last year under a shadow of fraud allegations, and now is potentially or reportedly sort of looking at making a plea deal. Although I think maybe his record is kind of mixed, because now I sort of see that he's making $250 to sort of record videos and things for that, for people, sort of whether it be happy birthday messages and things like that. So I think he's sort of, and potentially maybe going to earn more doing that as opposed to a lawmaker. But I think it's just been a really, I mean, it's just sort of captures how politically divided the Congress is, Washington is, and as we gear up to 2024, we're sort of probably going to see that heighten and escalate, where you know impeachment hearings like that. I'm already hearing reports that there are plans to look into President Biden and his family and business dealings, and so I think that's just going to continue. It's a trend that we've seen, you know, since Trump's administration, and it's likely to continue.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to go outside Washington, see who are the most successful politicians across our country in just a moment. My guests again today include Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and she's the senior author of the most recent edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. And also joining us is Russell Berman. Russell is staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers American politics. And he was a writer-producer for the venerable and often contentious McLaughlin Group on American television. And I'm pleased to have back with us Naomi Lim. Naomi is White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. All right, Russell, let's start with you. When you look out across our great country, who out there in the hinterland had an especially good year in politics?
Well, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, is getting a lot of attention. In his first year, he had a big election in 2022. He's got very good approval ratings, is talked about as a future presidential candidate. There was a big accident on I-95, and he did a very quick job with the federal government of getting that reopened. So I would say that Shapiro had a very good year.
All right, the governor of Pennsylvania, Jessica. Who do you highlight out there?
I think it was a good year for governors across the board. And I would point to Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who won the most contested election this cycle in our off-year 2023 races. He was reelected in a state that Trump won handily, beating a well-known Republican there, Daniel Cameron, who was backed by Mitch McConnell. So winning re-election even in a very red state. And I think he's someone, when we talk about, and I would put Josh Shapiro in this category as well, Wes Moore of Maryland, the governor there. that they do sort of represent a new generation of Democratic politics, especially when we look at where Biden is. Well, I mean, in both parties, both of the leading presidential candidates are not spring chickens by any means. So when I'm looking at, who sort of is the next generation of particularly Democratic leaders, I'm looking at a lot of the governors that are out there.
So spring chickens for our Arabic viewers
Sorry.
refers to young people. Put it
Yeah.
that way. Naomi, is there a Republican out across somewhere in America who had a good year other than Donald Trump?
In terms of governors, or I'm trying to think. Republican that had a good year other than Donald Trump. I mean, I feel like Donald Trump has sort of been taking up the whole bandwidth of attention. I was going to say one governor that I was going to mention that I've been watching is, and he's sort of a Democrat, but California Governor Gavin Newsom, just because we're sort of seeing a shadow campaign emerge, potentially as a backup for President Biden in 2024, but pivoting beyond that in 2028. I thought it was interesting. He's sort of been positioning himself with helping be this sort of counterpoint to Republican politics. We sort of saw him debate Governor Ron DeSantis on a highly watched Fox News debate, and sort of really trying to counter this idea of social issues and so-called culture wars. He also sort of did a foreign trip to China and was able to have a side-by-side sort of sit-down meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He did accidentally knock over a child while playing basketball, so I don't know whether that sort of takes sort of a chink out of his armor or sort of made it a little bit of a mixed trip. But he's sort of someone that sort of caught my eye as we go forward.
All right, very good. So with a lot of Democratic governors, Russell, Jessica, any Republicans outside Washington have a good year?
I think that there were some Republicans that left office that we're sort of looking at as potential, like, can they change within the party? Maryland's Larry Hogan that left, Chris Sununu, who's leaving as governor of New Hampshire. There was a lot of talk about Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, but the Virginia state elections did not go his way. So I think there are some that you can point to, but basically though, you run into, if you try to be different than Trump in a way or go against him, that you're not going to be successful at a national level. You might be successful in your own state and things, but and ultimately we also saw Youngkin made abortion a central issue in those state legislative campaigns, and we see across the board that, especially for Republicans, abortion is not a winning issue, and it's one that they're still struggling to respond to.
Very interesting that unless Russell, you have a good candidate, that we couldn't come up with a good Republican. A Republican who had sort of a banner year this year, even out in the hustle.
Yeah, I mean, I would say nobody had a banner year. I think Liz Cheney remains relevant in her post-congressional career. She's finished the year on a book tour, and obviously has been speaking out against Donald Trump. It remains to be seen whether she has any kind of future, whether it's in the Republican Party or, as an independent candidate. I think, sort of outside Washington in the sense of that he's from Florida, but got to say that Matt Gaetz was successful in his endeavor, the congressman from Florida who targeted Kevin McCarthy from the start and got him out of office.
All right, very good. I want to thank all of you for helping to helping our viewers understand the winners and losers of 2023. We're going to come back next year, and I'm going to ask you to give your predictions when we come back after New Year about what we're likely to see in 2024. But for now, thank you for joining me this week on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم استفسارات أو تعليقات على هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالقلق الذي يشعر به الحزبان في نهاية العام 2023، تواصلوا معي رجاء على @InsideWashington أو مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع القادم، وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.